Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for the Civicas Forum on Policing in Los Angeles. I'm Cynthia Hirschhorn, and I founded Civicas Women's Civic Action Network, a group of LA women leaders across sectors including education, foundations, government, nonprofit, and business, who are passionate about civic engagement, and for whom our goal is to create opportunities to learn about civic issues, connect with local leaders, and support positive change in our communities. As our mission is focused on engaging our members in complex civic challenges and advancing solutions through strategic connections, we believe we can amplify our impact at the civic scale by aligning our missions and thus the resources we navigate. Today's webinar, Policing in Los Angeles, Our History and Our Future, includes nationally recognized experts to explore how we got to this point, the big issues, and potential paths forward. It will be moderated by Deb Yang, Civicas Board Member, partner at Gibson Dunn, where she specializes in crisis management and litigation, former U.S. Attorney for the Central District of California, and former member of the LA Police Commission. Like the rest of our panelists, we are very grateful for the experience and expertise she brings to our discussion. Over the past 2 months, we've watched demonstrations in LA and across the country shed light on the crisis in policing. In the email Mayor Garcetti sent out this weekend about reimagining public safety in our city, he referenced the LA Times editorial affirming the LAPD's Community Safety Partnership provides a model for the kind of policing ethos we need. We are very honored to have 3 distinguished speakers today who are known nationally for their work in the policing area. They each have different backgrounds, different specialties, and different expertise, but all are deeply vested in police reform in a meaningful way. Ms. Rice, a co-founder and co-director at the Advancement Project, is renowned for her unconventional approaches to tackling problems of inequity and exclusion. Connie has received more than 50 major awards for her leadership of diverse coalitions and her non-traditional approaches to litigating major cases involving police misconduct, employee discrimination, and fair public resource allocation. She successfully litigated class action civil rights cases, winning more than $1.6 billion in policy changes and remedies during her 9-year tenure in the LA office of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Connie was a member of Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing and helped develop LAPD's Community Safety Partnership Program. That is the partnership model that Mayor Garcetti spoke of as being part of our future. Also on our panel is Jerry Chaliff. Mr. Chaliff is the former Special Assistant for Constitutional Policing to LAPD's Chief of Police. He is a criminal defense attorney who oversaw the LAPD's implementation of the federal consent decree while serving as commanding officer of the Consent Decree Bureau Police Administrator to the LAPD's Risk Management Bureau. Jerry also served as the first Special Assistant for Constitutional Policing to LAPD's Chief of Police and was a police commissioner, bringing perspectives from inside the department to today's conversation. Our third panelist, Carol Sobel, is a renowned civil rights lawyer and advocate. Prior to opening her solo practice, Ms. Sobel worked for 20 years for the ACLU in LA. She has been involved in every major protest lawsuit against the LAPD in recent decades, including successful litigation to block police actions against homeless individuals. Carol is currently among those suing the department on behalf of more than 4,000 protesters as part of a class action lawsuit led by Black Lives Matter, Los Angeles, and other activist groups. Carol serves on the board of directors for the National Police Accountability Project and reminds us to ask questions about the role of police in our criminal justice system while considering alternatives such as restorative justice. And now here is Deb Yang with questions for our panelists.
Thank you, Cynthia. And I want to thank all of the panelists for making the time today on this really important topic. I think all of us every day when we turn on the TVs and see our daily news are just inundated with all of the things going on with respect to skirmishes with the police all over the country. So thank you guys for the work that you do and your time today. I think it's important for us to sort of set the table and to understand a little bit of the history of what's gone on here in Los Angeles before we actually talk about where we are today. And I know that, you know, it began in 1965, actually it started before that, but most recently in 1965 with the Watts riots. and then that led to the McCone Commission, and then you continue on to the Rodney King incident in 1992, and the Christopher Commission, and a lot of the changes that arose out of that. But maybe if I could just first ask Jerry, if he could talk to us briefly about, some of the changes that the city has actually gone through with respect to police reform and some of the things that you saw, during those historical times at LAPD.
Thank you. Well, the Los Angeles Police Department has certainly tried to improve over the years. After Rodney King and what happened there, they tried to make some strides. I don't think they were as successful as they would like to have been. In the late 90s, the Department of Justice sent a letter to the Los Angeles, I think at that time I was president of the police commission, sent a letter saying basically under their jurisdiction, they were going to sue the city for unconstitutional patterns and practices, and that we could negotiate with the department to create a consent decree, which had 187 paragraphs and a number of reforms that had to be undertaken. When Bill Bratton arrived, he enthusiastically endorsed this and brought me into the department to, as he said, since I was one of the negotiators, I got us into this, it's time for me to help get us out of it. And we spent the next 11 years, we think, improving the department to the point in 2009, the LA Times and the Kennedy School both did surveys, and the trust of the police department in the communities across Los Angeles had risen markedly. And it's, if I might state, it's really important that the police have legitimacy. In other words, that the communities they serve trust them. That the police believe that that the communities believe that the police are acting in the community's best interest. And all of the reforms over the history have been an attempt to do that. And we are at a stage now where apparently departments that thought they had done a lot apparently hadn't done enough because, and I'm sure Connie and Carol can go into this at greater depth, but the history of policing is replete with the fact that the police department were not acting for the benefit of the community, they're acting for the benefit of a few. So you had the policing may have started in the United States by slave patrols that went out to make sure that slaves didn't escape. And you track the history down through the Jim Crow era, the response to segregation, the attitude that the police were warriors and it was their job to keep them from us, and you ended up to where we are today. So police have tried, a lot of the police departments across the country have tried to institute reforms. They've been weighted down by their own history and the fact that police aren't transparent enough and there isn't enough oversight by outsiders. And I think that's why we are where we are today.
No, Jerry, you raised a really good point, because I guess, I can ask Connie and Carol, do you have to have a situation where this is kind of oversight? You really are asking for, great change in institutions that have a long history and a long, sense of their own behavior and their own conduct. And so is it something like that where you have a consent decree or where you have a civilian oversight, that actually breaks through and enables change to occur? And is that something that that needs to continue? But I see other cities grappling with the same problems and kind of stuck in this quagmire of problems.
I'll talk briefly, and then Connie and Carol should. I had the benefit of viewing mostly from inside. They have the benefits from outside and being prime movers of pushing departments. But I think consent decrees were necessary because departments were going to change on their own. I think it takes really strong outside leadership and public support to change a department, because what you're changing is culture. And it takes a lot to change a culture, and it takes a long time because you got to start at the new people coming in, get to the sergeants and lieutenants who really run the department, because they're the people. You have to push up and down at the same time, And it requires a lot of hard work and fortitude because it doesn't happen overnight.
Connie, some thoughts on that, on whether or not the kind of changes that occurred here in Los Angeles were essentially a result of the consent decree, and whether, with that ending, whether or not the same kind of change. I know I don't want to jump ahead to where we are today, but I mean, just historically, do you need to have something like that? Because I do see all of these cities sort of stuck, not any real solutions in the near end.
Well, I want to echo a couple of things that Jerry said. The consent decrees the litigation will always be necessary. And all three of us have worked through litigation on the outside and represented protesters and victims. But we've also represented police officers who are whistleblowers. We've represented the Serpicos in the system. And so all three of us, I think, would agree, you've got to have outside pressure, which includes the litigation, includes legislation, it includes the commissions, it includes a whole lot of outside eyes, and the protests. You can't stop protesting. So the outside forces have got to continue. There are a few of us. I went inside to help Jerry when he was a deputy chief to enforce the consent decree, because you had a chief who understood that. And when Chief Bratton said, look, I'm not leaving here until the African-American community says that they trust the police more than when I came here. This decree, Judge Feast said, we're not ending this consent decree. We're not just letting this float away in the wind like the others. You burned the Christopher Commission report. You refused to do it. Now you're under my jurisdiction, and you're not getting out from this decree until I'm satisfied that the communities that have protested your policing feel better about it. That was the first time I'd ever. So the consent decrees last for as long as consent decrees last, but as soon as the consent decree is over, the DNA hasn't changed. So they go back to their default. And the folks you were working with who were change agents have either retired or they move on. And I think that's the situation we have today. As Carol, Jerry, and I were saying before the webinar started, there's no institutional memory. They won't even be able to tell you what happened with the consent decree. Some of them were in high school when the consent decree, or grade, junior high school, when a lot of the officers are younger now. A lot of the officers who helped us put in major changes. The voters have put in changes with charter amendments. We've got more accountability. The inspectors general are at least allowed to operate. When Carol and I first saw the first two inspectors general, they were run out of town on a rail by the chief of police, weren't even allowed to do investigations. And if an officer came into the inspector general's office, they were called by the chief of police and asked what they said, and they were given highway therapy and transferred. So we've come a long way, but I like to say, well, it's not your grandfather's LAPD, it's not Martin Luther King Jr.'s LAPD either. This is not a department that George Floyd, Rodney King, or Breonna Taylor would recognize as protecting them. And I'm going to go back to something that Jerry said. American policing descends from slavery. And it is therefore a containment suppression strategy. And my theory is that as long as you don't change the culture, as long as you don't change that mission, and as long as you don't change the policies of mass incarceration, mass arrest, mass stop and frisk in a car is what I call what LAPD does, until you change those tactics and strategies to enforce an extremely toxic mission, which to me, it really does resonate with Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow, the infrastructure of the New Jim Crow, which mass incarceration is just one policy of. Until you change and flip all of that, and until you start rewarding officers for actually providing safety instead of mass incarceration, enforcement, and suppression, you're not going to see a change. You're not going to find people in housing projects who say they trust LAPD or the sheriffs. You're not going to find people thinking that the police are any better than the gang members, because they're persecuted and hunted by both. And we who live in very safe neighborhoods are largely unaware of this, or we choose to be unaware of it. All we know is that there are certain areas of the city you don't go to because they're not safe. Well, guess what kind of policing those areas get? They don't get what we get. We get concierge safety. They get shock and awe, search and destroy enforcement. And until we change that and insist on that being changed, which is what the Community Safety Partnership Bureau is trying to do, you flip the incentives. You don't get rewarded for mass arrests. You don't get rewarded for mass stops. That's considered a failure. Your CompStat numbers are about how many kids did you keep out of the prison pipeline? How many kids did you divert to counseling? How many kids did you use restorative justice on? How many gang interventionists did you use to cooperate with the gangs to make the park and the library and the pool safe? There's a different physics in these neighborhoods, and the police have to be given permission to do that. And right now, we're struggling with that.
Yeah, I think, Connie, you raise excellent points, because in order to really have real change here, it has to be so deep. It has to be at so many, as Jerry said, so many layers below sort of just the command, because people who are on the street, in the training, in the mentality, that's the part, that I hear you saying is the flip.
Yeah, it's mindset, hearts and minds. Yeah.
Mindset, and also the rules. I remember when I used to do the use of force appeals and listen to them, a lot of times they dealt with folks who had mental health problems. And when the objective is containment, then that really changes the dynamic, because you can't let something play out. You can't let somebody come down from a high. And when you try to engage with them, it just starts to escalate. It's naturally problematic. So you raise great problems. I mean, great problems.
Sorry, guys.
You're right, Deb. We've criminalized homelessness. We've criminalized poverty. We've criminalized drug addiction. And at the same time, we've completely defunded these communities and left deserts. And Carol, jump in. You're our co-conspirator in crime here in trying to get policing that actually delivers safety to poor people.
So let me address one thing that's come up on the chat 4 times so far. Deborah Yang cannot turn up the volume any louder, so we apologize for that. But a number of people have asked about that on the chat so far. So I do, in the most recent years, I've really focused on the criminalization of homelessness. And when I thought about this panel today, and as I've worked on this issue over the last couple of years, the thing that I keep coming back to is, what do we make criminal in the first place? And why do we make it criminal? And I know from reading, various prosecutors, the Los Angeles city attorney, and when Bill Bratton came to Los Angeles with his broken windows policy, there is the assumption that if we arrest people, if we arrest people for really minor offenses, we will somehow get them on the straight and narrow, rather than asking the question about, what are we arresting people for in the first place? Is there an alternative? And what is the consequence of arresting them? Whether it's jail for a night, a record that disqualifies them from jobs, from housing, from benefits. We're trying to undo some of that now with the check the box law in California. You don't have to report if you were arrested. But we've got to ask ourselves, why are we arresting so many people in the first place? Let me give you a really good example of one issue that I've been trying to address for the last year. One of the most cited offenses for homeless people and for poor people generally in this city is having an open container of alcoholic beverage in public. And that means you had a bottle of beer with you. That's essentially what it means. And the officers touch the bottle, and if it's cold, they say, okay, you're violating the law, and you get cited for that. Now, a lot of it goes into the administrative citation program, but that's up to the individual officers. And some people actually get a criminal citation. The notion is that if we cite a lot of people for bottom line crimes, for minor offenses, they will fail to show up in the criminal justice system, and then that will go to warrant, and then we can get them much more seriously. And the bottom line is, why aren't we looking at these issues differently to begin with? So, for example, on something like having an open container in public, if we're talking about homeless people and we're talking about poor people who don't have homes necessarily where they can go to, why don't we have drop-in centers? Why don't we have places that operate on Skid Row in multiple ways, rather than having the police go out under some acronym like HOPE, or having the city attorney deal with people afterwards under some acronym like HEART, neither of which exist in either of those programs. Why don't we have a place where we can reach out to people without the police? Because the blue uniforms, people are fearful. What's going to happen if they approach me? And so I try to think about this issue as this is an opportunity for us to rethink what we make criminal and how we approach poor people. And this whole notion of creating a crime to get a hook into someone to, quote, change behavior. And particularly somebody, I think it was you, Deborah, who mentioned people who are mentally ill. If you look at the programs that the city has on that, for people who might be mentally ill and also committed a minor crime, it's backwards. It's absolutely backwards. And we have no, until recently, we had no services. I mean, we passed Prop 63, I guess it is, the millionaire's tax. The county was sitting on over $1 billion of unspent Prop 63 money, and people were going to jail because they were living on the streets and they were mentally ill. So this to me is an opportunity to re-examine what a criminal justice system looks like from bottom up. And reform is certainly part of that. But before you get to reform, what did we make criminal in the first place?
Yeah, you know, one of the examples that came to mind from when you raised this issue with me earlier, was actually 3 strikes law. At the time that it was passed, everybody thought it was a great idea. Everybody was into more incarceration especially for people who were repeat offenders. And then they started to see the fallout from that, because a lot of those offenders, the first 2 prior incidents were for minor kinds of activities. And all of a sudden they were looking at huge penalties. So I think you raise a really good question about trying to undo some of that, because for years, and I've been in law enforcement for years, all I keep seeing is more, right? So this is a crime now, this is a crime. Now, a petty theft is a lower amount. I mean, and it's almost, when I sat as a misdemeanor court judge, I used to see people in front of me and I used to think to myself, this is really sad because these people don't belong here. I get it, I understand the system, but they really don't belong here. They need other kinds of help. And so, I mean, Carol, some of the stuff that you're talking about, is some of the deep change that we really need to think about and do. But how do we get there? I mean, I guess that's one of the things. It's like, how do we actually get to a point where we start to undo some of that and start to get people to look at this on a deeper level and affect that kind of change that you talk about?
If I could jump in for a second, we have a perfect time now to do some of what Carol and Connie have talked about. People are now coming forward with all of these defund the police, which really means reallocate resources. There's a time, and nobody's doing this yet, I don't believe. For like example, in Los Angeles, they just went in and said, okay, we're going to cut $150 million out of the police budget. We're not going to hire people and we won't pay cash overtime. Why don't we instead stop and start looking at what we want the police to do? What is it the police should do? Should they be dealing with homeless? Should somebody else be dealing with the homeless, the mentally ill? And if you do that, you can at the same time decide that carrying an open container isn't something that the criminal justice system should bother with. And you can, these two working together, but until we sit down and say, we're going to have a real discussion about what we want our police to be. Some people say, we talk about the police departments, it should be the police services department, which should be there to service the community. Broken windows, which Carol talked about, the original broken windows wasn't what it turned out to be. It sort of morphed over time into this zero tolerance so that we can do whatever we're going to do, which led to stop, question, and frisk in New York. And as Connie called it, the mobile stop and frisk in Los Angeles, which just breeds distrust between communities and police. But I think we really have an opportunity now, if the elected leaders want to take advantage of it, to start determining what do we want out of a police department. I mean, if you look at the statistics, I think it's like 11, 12, 14% of the time police spend is dealing with violence. The rest of the time they're doing all kinds of other things, because most cities have just piled on to the police department You deal with homeless, you deal with trash, you deal with this, you deal with the mentally ill, you deal with noise. That's not, we should really take the opportunity and really decide what we want departments to do. And that should then lead us to what do we want to criminalize.
If I can add one other thing quickly. Economically, I think that changing how we focus on the criminal justice system saves us money too. According to the UCLA $1 Million Hoods Project, it's $129 a night to put somebody in the LAPD jail. 2 officers, and the department did a study in 2013 because of the massive amount of overtime that was occurring, and so they wanted to limit that. So we have a law in California that says, you release somebody in the field. We have clients who got taken to jail for having quote illegal shopping carts. So they spend the night in jail, they get left out at 2 in the morning, it's the winter, it's cold, they have lost all their property. What was the point of that? The shopping cart didn't cost that, but 2 officers take them in. So to arrest somebody for something like that cost the city about $400 per person. We could put people into apartments and motels for less than we are spending to arrest them on something like having their possessions in an illegal shopping cart. And so the question is not only what do we not make criminal, but what are the economics of this? And the economics say you need to change your focus because it costs us too much. And then the money isn't available to provide the people the support they need to get established, to get a place that's secure, that's off the street.
And Carol, I mean, so some of the changes that you're talking about, are big changes for, our elected officials to engage in. Are there baby steps that we can take? Are there small ways that we can get there? Or is that where it sits? Because I've seen how, the role of police unions sometimes have some say in what's going on and other sort of constituencies. How do we get on that path in a better way?
Well, so one thing I would say, and I think Connie may be better able to answer this, is that we have no shortage of serious crime that needs to be attended to. And so it isn't that we're going to have necessarily markedly fewer police. It's that we're going to refocus where it needs to be focused. And I think, we did this, so the police commission, and I don't know whether either of you were on in 2013, I don't think Jerry was, but the police commission did this study. And the reason they did the study is they were very concerned about the amount of overtime that went into arresting someone at the end of a shift and taking them into the station. So they did a study on what it costs to do a cite and release in the field, what it costs to book and release immediately, and what it costs to do a long form booking. And, but they made it optional. They made it at the discretion of the officer. And I think that there could be more direction from the top about what are our priorities as a city and as the residents of this city, and leave less to the discretion of the officer about when to take somebody in. And maybe on, I mean, there are lots of other issues where I think we could decide that we are no longer going to make something a crime. And we're going to try to get somebody into, whether it's restorative justice or something else, without all the punitive attachments. The city has started this type of program, but it always comes with some form of punitive consequence that defeats what they're trying to do.
I think we know what to do, Deb. And we've been doing it on a pilot level. In my mind, you do change the incentives, which is what we've been talking about. You change what you ask your officers to do. You change how you frame their jobs. What are you supposed to be going after? But you also have to change not just the incentives. You have to change the mission. And you have to end the warrior culture of impunity. There is an impunity infrastructure that starts with you go to the Police Bill of Rights, you look at the exoneration system that used to be the discipline system. It's better now, but you still have a system that basically The presumption is that you don't want to lose the investment in this officer. The police chief can't fire officers that should be fired still. So there's still the discipline and the accountability infrastructure, but they have rigged, the police have rigged through their unions so much impunity that the message is, and the Supreme Court through qualified immunity doctrine has made it so that egregious constitutional violations don't even get adjudicated anymore. And the cops get the message, oh, I shot up the whole pool party and because of qualified immunity and they can't reach the issue, that must be okay. You saw the impunity in Buffalo with the Buffalo officers knocking that 75-year-old man over and walking over him as his head bled out. You saw it in Atlanta with the Morehouse students who were not armed. They were in their cars, and because the cops were on a sort of tantrum riot, they broke the car windows, tased the students, and didn't care. Everybody was yelling at them, "Stop! Stop! Stop!" When you see Chauvin with his knee on George Floyd's neck, and he puts his hands in his pockets and looks directly at the phone camera as if to say, yes, I get to do this. And you want to know why? Because nothing's going to happen to me. That's the warrior culture of impunity that you still see. And when you have the warrior cops saying nothing can be done to us, we get to do what we want, it breeds a kind of corruption, the kind of corruption you see emerging in the FI cards. Well, they're very cynical about that. It's like you want data, you want arrests, hey, we'll do it at the end of our shifts and we'll just put anybody we want in there. That has been a perennial problem. That's a 50-year-old problem. That's nothing new. So the incentives, the warrior culture of impunity, the infrastructure of impunity, which still exists, you have it now, Deb, where you can't, if you're a prosecutor, you can't find out if a cop lied on the stand. That's absurd. So that's what I mean by the infrastructure of impunity. You also have a mindset change, and I call it the guardian mindset versus the shock and awe, search and destroy gladiator mindset. And search and destroy, by the way, is not my term. That's a term that a former chief of police called what he did when he was a crash gang cop. He said, Connie, we were in there to search and destroy. What we didn't understand was that when you destroy the community with this mass incarceration stuff, you don't just destroy them, you destroy yourself. That's when I knew I could become that cop's partner, because he got it. So you have to change the mission, this mass incarceration mission. Cop didn't wake up one morning and think of that. Cop didn't wake up one morning and think of 3 strikes, you're out. Our politicians and we put those policies in place. We built the prisons to make them inevitable, and we created a mass incarceration juggernaut that has resulted in the following. And think about this, and I've asked cops to think about this. If you're an officer and this fact doesn't make the hair on your neck stand up, you need to leave your badge and your gun on the table and resign. In Nickerson Gardens, after 35 years of mass incarceration strategy and 3 strikes and you're out, and mass stop strategies that we ask the police to carry out, if you're an African-American man between the ages of 18 and 24 and you live in Nickerson Gardens housing project in Watts, every time you step out of your unit, you face a 45% chance of going to jail. Not being stopped, a 45% chance of going to jail. That is nuts. And you can't say it's because of his criminal behavior. It isn't. It is simply the result of what we've done for the last 40 years. And the cops I talk to, they want that changed. They don't want that to be the result of their work, because they know it's not providing poor people's safety. It's just providing poor people being hunted and preyed upon and put into a mass incarceration strategy. So the officers I work with, they want something different. And so Charlie Beck and we and the community created something different. We call it partnership policing. It goes beyond community policing. These are the only officers in LAPD for 9 years, not a shot fired, not a complaint filed. They have reduced crime with the community, and it's a partnership. So they sit down with the community and they do holistic wraparound safety, not shock and awe enforcement, not racking up arrests, not trying to exert your alpha male apex predator presence as a cop. You're there to help the community solve problems that create crime. You're there to remove the criminogenic conditions of the neighborhood. Grape Street Alley has mattresses and it's an open drug bazaar. The grandmothers asked the CSP cops, can you help us get public works down here and clean the alley? Can you make sure the gym and the library and the pool and the park are open to our kids and not controlled by the gangs? We don't want the gang members arrested unless they're doing something violent, but can you do it without arrests? And that's what Chief Beck dedicated himself to. He said, I'm going to clean up MacArthur Park without arrests, and I'm going to enlist the gang members to help us. That is a complete mindset change from I'm going to lock everybody up I meet to I'm going to get to know everybody's name. I'm going to sit down with the community leaders. I'm going to ask the community how they want to be kept safe, not how I can do enforcement so I can look tough for SWAT to get into a specialized unit. That's the warrior mentality. You want the guardian mentality instead. UCLA just evaluated this program and found that it reduced crime at a steeper rate than even the countywide and citywide crimes outside of the CSP sites. And it increased trust. 2,000 residents were interviewed with surveys and interviews and focus groups, and they all said, we want the CSP we had in 2015 and 2016. Bring those cops back. They helped my family. They kept my kid out of jail. They helped us solve problems. They empowered us to take over the programs locally. We now have complete wraparound systems, and we want them back. So it's not that my clients have never asked for no police. They've asked for police who don't prey on them. They've asked for police who help them and keep them safe, not terrified.
You know, Connie, I remember when I was on the commission that the Summer Nights Lights program was ongoing, and it was just growing and growing and growing. And I saw some of what you were talking about and where the community really wanted it and really cared about it and were very responsive. So seeing this partnership and reading about it before, you know, our Zoom call today really it opened up my heart, because I thought this is so fantastic. And, you know, and we need more of that, because it's what you said. You stop that cycle of just another generation of people who are going to engage in that same kind of conduct. And it gives people hope and a way sort of up and into a better life for themselves and their family and the community. But what do we need to do? I mean, how is that set up? Is it a separate bureau within LAPD? Is it separately funded? I read different things and I wasn't sure how the funding and how it came to exist. Well,
as usual with this kind of change, you're building the airplane while you fly it. This is the first, we asked for a bureau, a full up bureau. So that if you're a rookie officer, you can go from the academy all the way to chief of police being a guardian. And it's the only way that you can re-engineer the culture of an institution that is so grounded and run. I mean, its DNA, RNA is warrior policing, and it's mass suppression containment policing. And to get away from that, you have to create a parallel structure inside of LAPD. Because if you're a CSP officer, you've got gang units sabotaging you, you've got patrols sabotaging you, you've got sergeants who make fun of you and roll call because they don't believe in this. They call it women's policing because it requires communication, problem solving, de-escalation, and success. And I said, you can call it women's policing all you want. It is women's policing because it's smarter. And it actually solves the problem. And it de-escalates, and it has less violence, and there are no complaints. And they don't want that because it's against the sort of macho Rambo image that they have of themselves. They like, you know, sock them down, you know, shoot first, ask questions later. They like the military equipment. They like riding on the sideboards with a pump gun at 2 o'clock in the morning. You know, it's boys and their toys, and it's absolutely absurd. And if you take that away from them, you're threatening them. And they call it, you know, CSP. You can imagine what the P is. And I said, yeah, I'll claim that too. Yes, it is women's policing. It's disproportionately female. A lot of female officers in this unit, and overwhelmingly of color, people who grew up in these neighborhoods, people who speak the languages, people who understand the cultures, people who look at the human beings as human beings, not just arrest fodder, not just people they can get a righteous shoot with and look aggressive so that SWAT picks them up first. And I'm quoting officers who tell me how they see South Bureau and Hollenbeck. Oh yeah, Miss Rice, if I go to South Bureau, we call that stick time because we get to use all our weapons because it's crime so high, nobody will complain. And if I get a righteous shoot, Miss Rice, and look aggressive, SWAT will pick me first. Those are the incentives of the warrior cop culture. And what we're trying to do is seed and wire and lock into a powerful platform within LAPD, which is a bureau. And this bureau will have, and once it's up, we'll have 2 deputy chiefs, 1 civilian, one sworn, modeling the partnership between the community and the police.
And I read somewhere that there was private funding that was involved in the partnerships. How does that-
Some of the programs have private funding, but no, these are salary lines that are already within LAPD. Jerry, what were you going to say?
I was going to add something that the group, people listening may not understand. When you look at the police department, rank and structure is incredibly important from the top, sending a message. When I joined the police department, I told Chief Bratton that I had to, 1, report to him, 2, I had to be on the same floor with all the chiefs, and 3, I had to have rank. So I became a civilian deputy chief. I was on the office right around the corner from him, and I only reported to him. The same thing now with this, and I had a bureau. The same thing now with this, was when CSP was just inside other stations and divisions, it didn't have the imprimatur that was given. By now, it's a bureau. It has a deputy chief who only reports to him, who was specially selected. And it's on the officers are on the 10th floor, which is where the chief is and the assistant chiefs are. And that sends a strong message that's saying, I'm the chief and I think this is important. And as it expands out, which is what it's going to do, it will carry that. I've heard the CSP described as social work. Not quite as vulgar as some of the things Connie's heard, but I think until they breach that gap by saying this is important, and until the CS people start getting promoted, it will send a message that this is the kind of policing we want.
What's funny about that, Jerry, is that at ComStat, it's the CSP units that have the steepest crime reductions.
Of course.
CSP was created as a trust model because Chief Beck said, can I get the folks in Watts who hate us? Can we get those folks to ever trust us? What would it take? So we tried this. We said, let's end the warrior cops and let's do the whole, let's change to a public health model. Let's do safety wraparound. Let's do violence reduction. Let's not lock up every kid in baggy pants or every kid who's a member of the gang, because if you don't join the gang, they'll kill you. Let's instead focus on the conditions that leave people in this kind of despair. And let's help the community and empower the community to fix those. But so it was created as a trust mechanism, but lo and behold, who knew trust is a better crime fighting strategy? Because people now pick up the phone and say, you know, that kid in the alley that was a shooter, look at so-and-so. They might not testify, but they trust these cops to keep them safe from retaliation. So they report more of what they see going on. And because they're forced to plan the wraparound strategy together, you have Black and Latino residents forced to get along with officers who are trained to solve problems with the community. It's holistic safety. It's not search and destroy enforcement or mass incarceration. And the community backs it. But the funny thing is that it actually reduces crime, and the clearance rates are 30% higher with CSP.
This is what I talked about at the beginning about police legitimacy, that people have to trust the police and the police have to trust the police. And just by the way, as an aside, when you were talking about women, there's a fascinating article about how to reform police. This author's solution is real simple: hire more women.
That's right.
Period.
You know, it does, 2 questions, but one, does the police chief, you know, whomever is the police chief, is that such a big part of making sure that this program stays alive, or that you get the buy-in? I know, you know, with Chief Beck, he was very committed to it. He'd spent a lot of time down in the South Bureau, and so really understood, I think, the community very well. But, you know, how does that role sort of play into this?
Well, let me just briefly, and then Carol and Connie, without the support of the chief and the chief's telling everybody how important it isn't going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
And
No, go ahead, Carol.
okay, if I can just add something. I think too that for Chief Beck, if I remember correctly, as people mentioned, he was assigned in the south part of LA, and his partner, unusual at the time, was Earl Pasinger, because white cops didn't work with black cops. And I heard Charlie talk about being a partner with Earl Pasinger early on and how different that experience was. And, Connie and I have represented, we brought a class action on behalf of women along with Barry Litt, and the kinds of harassment and the punitive measures and attacking people who would partner with women, who would work with women, who would see women. We had clients who were known as Cagney and Lacey, but that they had great records, but they couldn't promote because they were women. And I just want to add one other thing. So the partner that Connie had in Chief Beck, the way I met Chief Beck was shortly after Chief Bratton came here. Chief Beck became the Captain 3 at Central Division, which is Skid Row. And we had just obtained an injunction against stop and frisk on Skid Row, where the police were basically throwing up every black man who stepped out on the street against the wall and running them for wants, warrants, and absconders. It was, the ink was barely dry on this injunction. It was maybe 6 months after the injunction, and Charlie came in. He's the new Captain 3, and the very first thing he did, along with Bratton's support, was do this program called, quote, Operation Enough. Terrible name, but they always have to have names for them, and basically did exactly what the court had just enjoined. And it prompted a discussion that I've had multiple times with people in the department about how do we get institutional memory? How do we not keep repeating the same failures? It isn't even an issue about whether or not these kinds of programs are constitutional. They are not. They've already been told they're not by a court. But what we see because of what Connie talks about and the way that people are rewarded in this department, people continue to do the exact same thing that just was declared unlawful. And so part of it, part of the struggle that we have here is how do we get on the same page with the entire command staff? And I think a lot of that comes from the chief and how you organize it. But I think that is a really key issue, because I don't understand how some of these programs get approved without a chief's imprimatur on them, at least not at that time, and how the history keeps repeating itself in a bad way.
I feel, Carol, that the system that is set up right now sort of promotes the problem that you just keep talking about, right? Because inherent in that system, you have, I'm not, blaspheming the union. I'm just saying the union is there to look after the officers' interests, right? But who's sitting there consistently on each decision and at the table representing the community or the constituents? You just don't have it. So much happens, as Connie was saying, that becomes part of the system that other people, just don't see or aren't tasked to or aren't following. And so I feel like some of that is some of the slippage that you see. And I get it. I mean, for people who have been working at this and trying to get it right for so many years, it's very discouraging when you start to see things slip away because people just don't have that memory. I had this conversation recently with some young folks, and I was referencing, where were you when the Rodney King incident happened? And they said, Deb, I wasn't alive. I went, oh my gosh. Wow, when did that happen? So, I think that's part of what we're also dealing with. But, let me turn for a second, because, and Connie and Jerry, is there anything else on the CSPs that, that we should be thinking about sort of going forward? Because I want to move on to and talk about protests with Carol, but I feel like it's such a great program, and you've put it now in, I think, 5 locations. And they seemed, if you, anything close to the kind of statistics that you're getting, just make it seem almost like a no-brainer. But clearly you have a vision as to the kinds of things that need to be done for it to continue to have its success and proliferation.
Well, there are a couple of things. Understand that CSP for a full site has to go where you have an epidemic level of a problem, either violence or crime, because it's such a concentration of resources. You don't do it citywide. So the full site is one thing. Getting the CSP mindset, cops who see themselves interfacing with the community in a humane, compassionate way, as opposed to what happens in South Bureau, for example. I had two people who work for an organization I advise. One had a master's from UCLA, another had a BA. One Latino male, one African-American male. They were in a car with paper plates that drove right off so it's illegal to have paper plates for a month till you get your plate. Metro pulled them over at gunpoint and ordered them out of the car. And the first question Metro asked these two graduates of UCLA is, are you on probation or parole? That doesn't happen in the West Side. And so until you change that kind of attitude, that's where the CSP mindset changes the warrior mindset, where it interfaces. You can change how the rest of the officers, whether they're doing CSP or not, view the public, poor public of color and poor immigrant communities, how they interact with them. They can do it in a shock and awe, disrespectful, dehumanizing way, which is what they do now, or they can take the CSP way. So there is a place for getting the mindset and the public interface to be more CSP, more guardian-like. And then there's actually changing shock and awe warrior policing. You do need your warriors, you need SWAT, but you only need them for 1% to 4% of the calls that you get over a year. I mean, you don't need them very often. So what are you going to do with the rest of that? So there's a CSP infusion of values and how you interact with the community. How that plays out, it's in 11 sites right now, but that has to be done as a professional assessment. CSP sites cannot be handed out like Halloween candy just because a council person wants one. They have to be professionally assessed. The community has to be prepared to engage as a partner with the police, and you have to do a wraparound safety plan. So all of that is something separate. But with those three buckets, you can make CSP change how LAPD interacts in poor areas and poor immigrant areas.
If I can add something, a couple things. One, to get the mentality to change, you have to tell the officers what you want them to do. And then you have to judge them, and you have to find a measuring point of how do you judge whether they're performing or not. In the old days, it was just arrests, citations, how many people you shot, whatever the standard was. Now you're trying to do something that's less mathematically able to. So as Connie said, how many problems did you solve by picking kids or doing it, which is much more difficult to do. And then you have to reward these officers who do the right thing, either by promotion or by assignment. And that has to go out across the department so that people understand. When we started the consent decree, one of the big things we had to do is figure out how are we going to audit ourselves. Well, you couldn't get anybody to work auditing because that's like being an accountant to some of them. And they joined the police department to carry guns and do other things. So we had to start rewarding the people that were in that division. And once that started happening, people with different mindsets started coming in, and we were able to do a lot of good. So I think those are things you have to do internally.
I don't know. It's amazing, what's been, accomplished so far. It's just trying to sort of stay on that and make sure that change really becomes more part of the system as opposed to just sort of a touch and go. Because as Connie recounts those numbers, and numbers don't lie, they give the kind of things that we want as a community as far as, crime coming down. It's safer for everybody. And with that, it's also cost saving. So all of those kinds of benefits are great. Well, let me turn for a moment because it's I want to talk about protests. And I know, Carol, that you're so active in litigating in this field, along with other fields where you sort of hold behavior in check. But, we see, on the nightly news, just, it looks like mayhem all over the country. And even I, with all my years in law enforcement, look at that and think, how do you just start to break that down and make that calmer and, let people have their First Amendment rights and, and communicate how they feel, and yet do it in a safe manner, because, there are times when behavior gets out of control. So I know you've been on the forefront. Could you talk to us about, some of what you're seeing and doing there?
Sure. I think that, I'm not going to suggest that there aren't some people who go beyond what would be allowable First Amendment expression. The task of law enforcement is to isolate those people. It is almost always just a few people that do that. But there are two things. And I think that one of the things that I'm hearing a lot said about the situation in Portland, and certainly the situation here in LA, and otherwise it happened at Black Lives Matter in Pan Pacific Park, is how do the police escalate these situations? And I think back to the post-Rodney King uprisings, and there was going to be a protest outside the old Parker Center, and the protest was being led by Maxine Waters and Reverend Jesse Jackson. And I had gone to Parker Center with Maxine's staff to negotiate the terms of the protest with the then captain, Jerry Connell. And in the middle of that, I think the police commission had removed Daryl Gates from service. So in the middle of this very productive discussion with the captain on what was going to happen, in walked 18 Metro officers with their hands on their weapons, and they sat down facing me. And I will never, Pat McKinley was the most senior person, if anybody remembers Pat McKinley. He's a big guy. He was, he was a nice guy, but he was a Metro guy, So they all sat there with their hands on their weapons facing me. I'm, for people who don't know me, I'm 5'2.5". Not particularly threatening. I've never operated a gun in my life, but I stood my ground with my ballpoint pen. And so we negotiated that the police would not come out and form a SWAT line, essentially, because the protest would go along and it would be done and that would be it. Well, Metro could not contain itself, and halfway through the demonstration, inside the old glass walls of Parker Center, Metro appeared in riot gear and just lined the entire place. It changed the entire focus of the demonstration. And I've had this discussion with various chiefs in the LAPD about, if you come out in riot gear and you stand a few feet from the protesters who are peaceful, you will become the focus, and then the thing will escalate out of control. And every time that we've convinced them not to do that, it has worked. So after, I think it might have been after May Day, probably was after May Day in 2007, we had a lot of discussions on Hollywood Boulevard, and the police adopted a different model in Los Angeles, where the SWAT was still ready, the horses were ready, all of that was ready, but they were several blocks away. They could get there quickly, but they were not the focus. And so one of the things I think that and this is what I hear in Portland and other cities, and I hear public officials talking about it. We had it under control until DHS showed up in camouflage and masked officers and took people in unmarked vans and just disappeared them. I think that the police are always afraid of demonstrations, and they shouldn't be as afraid of demonstrations the way that they are. They could focus on a small group of people if that's where the problems were. And that certainly would have happened, for example, with the Democratic National Convention, where they used, we were in the parking lot for a Staples Center. They used tear gas from behind the fence to try to stop a small group of youth who were breaking up the concrete parking stoppers and throwing them towards the police. And actually, Charlie Beck was in charge of that. So he was the one spraying the tear gas on people. So they, in that situation, they emptied everyone out of the back cab because no one wanted to be tear gassed, and people were still listening to what was going on, but it wasn't enough for the police. And they rode in on horseback with batons and, you know, and then opened rubber bullets on everyone. So I think that we have to have a new dynamic of how we allow protests to occur, how we figure out who legitimately is interfering with the right of people to protest, and remove those people. And that's what the law requires. That's what they've done and have done in the past. But it seems that the LAPD always reverts to mass force. And, you know, that was a lot of what happened in the George Floyd protests, particularly at 3rd and Fairfax, where the mass force was used to protect Rick Caruso's property.
Yeah, you know, I'm gonna start looking for what you say, isolation, because you're right, because it's supposed to be isolation in a way. I think part of that is that warrior mentality and that training that Connie, you know, spoke about earlier gets, just comes to the front, and in many incidents takes over, because they're also trained to fight, right? And so, and to provide safety. So this feels like that kind of moment, and you have such an incredible conflict there. Well, we're at the end of our panel, and now we're going to turn to the Q&A. I want to let everybody know that I see some of the questions that have been coming in through the platform, but I've also had other questions that were sent in earlier. So I don't know that we can get to all of them, but we're going to try and get through a good chunk of them. But I think one of them is, you know, given the kind of group that this is, you know, of leaders in the community, you have some, you know, who were former elected officials. You also have others who are heads of organizations and NGOs. What can we as citizens and philanthropists and voters do to help support some of the reforms that you guys are talking about, and do it effectively? Because I think there's a great interest in that.
Can I just say one quick thing about that, and then I'm going to leave it to Connie and Jerry. I think that in this moment, one of the questions that I have is who leads that discussion, and whether it is the politicians that lead that discussion or it is the community that leads that discussion. And I think that it has to be, we have to elevate the voice of the community, and not have it be top down.
Connie, thoughts on
And even in that proposition is complexity, because you have to ask within which community, and then with that community, which sub-communities within the particular community. LA is extremely complex. I'll give you an example. I know that the Black Lives Matter activists who've taken a hashtag and created an international movement to make Black Lives Matter. It's an amazing thing. They've changed the politics on this issue. They have made it a focus. They have brought the fourth reckoning with white supremacy to this country, and they get nothing but a standing ovation from me. They also are going to continue to attack any program that operates within policing, because the different sub-factions, some of them actually want to eliminate police, others want the allocation of resources redone. A lot of it we would agree with, but I think that they've got to keep pushing from the outside and attacking people like me and attacking programs like even CSP, because that's part of their ideological mission, and they should continue to do it. That's their job. For those of us who understand that once the protests are over, you actually have to re-engineer how cops think of themselves and how they behave. That mindset, culture, behavior change is what has to be done inside a department, and it has to be done by cops with outside partners. That's the only way I've ever seen it stick. The community comes in as the partnership once you have reformed cops. It won't work if you don't have cops who have transformed themselves from the gladiator, shock and awe warrior mindset to the guardian safety mindset. I really think at this time, what wealthier, privileged people can do on two fronts is understand which policies to back, and understand that everything you back is probably going to get attacked if you're talking about working with police and improving police. but that's just the moment that we're in, and there's a good reason that we're here, and I don't condemn it at all. I accept it, and it's necessary. The lawsuits will continue to be necessary, but inside, you can help the police commission ask the right questions. On homelessness, take Carol Sobel's agenda of questions and challenges to both the politicians and the police and say, why are you still doing X, Y, and Z, confiscating people's shopping carts, criminalizing homelessness? You haven't spent the money. You need to inform yourselves on which issues to ask for, because we are far more powerful in the political spectrum. And when people who are privileged and have law degrees and have money ask questions, they're forced to answer a different agenda, rather than simply asking for the continued subsidies of our home patrol systems, which is a waste of money. It's a waste of public money. It should go to gang diversion, and it should go to CSP. So there are things that you get. On the other front, I would say in the racial reckoning, get the skills and the tools that it's going to take to engage in some very uncomfortable conversations if we're to move beyond this simply being a flash in the pan protest once again. Because once the white marchers leave and white privileged voters leave the scene, the change doesn't happen. You have a critical role to play. All of us in privileged communities do, but we have to get the tools and the introspection of our role in these systems. We have to take a really hard, cold eye at it and not take the criticisms personally. We've got one more chance to get this racial injustice agenda right. This is the fourth reckoning in my vision of this country's history, and it may be the last chance we get to do it.
Yeah,
I could just,
go ahead, Carol.
I'm sorry, just follow up on two quick things. You know, I think that those of us who come from really sort of privileged positions aren't aware that the Black Lives Matter agenda is from their perspective, they have never stopped protesting from when they began. They have actions scheduled every single week. What has changed is that the video of George Floyd brought us to a different point, not them. They are continuing to struggle, and no one wanted to give them the time that they deserved prior to this, and they will continue. And Connie's right, you know, the white allies have a different role to play here, which brings me to my second point. It's not my agenda, it's the agenda of my clients. And I can help them give voice to that by creating space with the litigation, but bottom line, it is their agenda. And just to follow up a little bit on what I said before, you know, we were successful in getting all of the arrest citations for the misdemeanors and the infractions dismissed, and we appreciate the city attorney doing that. The initial instinct was to do what Chief Moore called a lecture on the responsibility of engaging in First Amendment activity, to which our response was, what about a lecture about the responsibility of the police to allow people to engage in First Amendment activity? But now it is a situation where the city is approached all of these much more mainstream institutions and organizations to create a dialogue, but the community's voice is still not in there because they are not those well-financed organizations. They have a different voice, and if we don't listen to their voice and don't give them a fair opportunity to communicate that without all the trappings of demonstrations, everything, then that whole dialogue by the city becomes meaningless because we cannot decide for the community.
Can I add one thing? Education, understand what the issues are, and give meaningful input to make sure that your elected officials don't take the cheap, easy way out. Like, we'll cut $150 million out of a budget before doing the hard work to figure out what really should be done. And be supportive of those who are willing to take on the hard fight of police reform, because you kept talking about the union. But if you look at who gives money to city council members, say in Los Angeles, police union is right up there at the top. And they deal with the council members every single day. And they have a lot of influence because they have a lot of members who are who contribute to them. So I think it's to think of the issues, learn about the issues, and then push your elected officials to do something meaningful and not easy. Because real reform is not easy.
Yeah, and Sherry, we had a number of questions about, what can we do with respect to, police unions blocking any sort of reformative changes, and how do we as citizens do that? It sounds like it's accountability with our elected officials, or is there more to it than that?
No, it's accountability. Sorry about the phone. Part of it is accountability, but part of it is pressure, because if you're somebody who lives in a district and you own a bunch of businesses and you call your council member and say, first of all, you get to talk to him or her. Second of all, if you say it's important, then it becomes important to them too. And I think that's where it comes. It's as long as the people those who have privilege, those who have influence, use that privilege and use that influence and keep pushing on it, things will happen. And part of that is you have to get educated. Panels like this, but start to read this op-ed pieces every day in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and all over the country are now talking about police reform. They will lead you to books, articles, to where you can start learning more about it. And then there are those people who are out always talking about it, and listen, and then form your own opinions, but push on the people that we elect.
Okay, thank you. One of the questions came in: what role does Post have on the issues we're talking about, and how can we make changes to that on a statewide basis?
Post is the police officer standard and training, which sets the standards for police officers. And police officers have, I think it's every 2 years, have to qualify a minimum 24 hours or something of training. If you add things to the training that change the mission, that's how you do it. So if you make de-escalation training, if you make conflict resolution training part of Post, part of the required courses, you will begin to change some of the attitudes, because that's
we're getting the CSP training, which is
yes.
taught by trauma specialists, gang interventionists, other academics. It's not just police training, epidemiologists. We're getting that curriculum certified by Post.
That's great, Connie. When I became a judge, I had to go through a training, and part of that actually had to do, it was bias training, and it was recognizing your own biases. I don't know whether or not Post has anything like that, but I found it powerful because it reminded you that you don't come into it at zero.
Every department, every large city department in the country is doing implicit bias training now.
Right.
Some of it's very good.
Yeah, but most people don't understand enough to know where implicit bias figures in the spectrum of this stuff. What we're talking about is structural and systemic policies that have the racism built in from slavery. Implicit bias training is at the individual level, but isn't going to impact that. The big drivers of what we see in these communities in terms of mass arrest, mass incarceration, the destruction of entire communities, implicit bias isn't going to touch that. So people think that if they have an implicit, one deputy chief after LAPD completely botched the reaction to the protests, and please think of them as protests and not riots. There wasn't so much as a barbecue fire in Watts, which tells you some of the progress that we made, because they could have easily gone up in flames had we been at the level of tension post Rodney King. But these were protests. These were peaceful protests, and to get to the point where you can begin to see the difference, that differentiation. I think bias has some place in it, but there's a whole spectrum of awareness. There's a whole spectrum of understanding how each of our tribes participates in this larger psychodrama, our historical psychodrama coming out of slavery. I mean, it sounds like a bunch of jargon, but we each have a role at the individual level and at the systemic level. Understanding what your role is in each of those paradigms is important. At the individual level, intent matters. Intent matters. At the structural impact policy level, intent does not matter. I mean, they're all you need to inform yourself. As someone white, you need to understand the role of whiteness. That sounds like a strange thing to say. There's a woman with a PhD. Her name is Dr. Battalaora, Battlaora. Have her do one of your panels. She is a wonderful PhD who talks about her own exploration of whiteness and how it connects up with the political constructs that perpetuate systemic racism. You need to understand that stuff to be able to engage and understand where each of our places is in this national dialogue, if we're going to have it. In the past, we don't have it. We get out and we protest the brutality, but when it comes time to get to the radical reconstruction of our systems, everybody disappears because all of us benefit. Those of us who are on this call, I doubt that there's anybody who's actual target of these systems, including myself. We benefit from them. And as beneficiaries of them, we have a different role in deconstructing them.
One of the questions is, how do we attract a different kind of person who wants to be a police officer? Somebody who has more of a holistic approach. Maybe they have training in social work. I don't know, maybe they're women. How do we go about doing that? I mean, and especially now when I think recruitment it strikes me that it's lower than it has been in the past.
Well, one of the things, first of all, you have to rid the system of its biases in hiring. And in Los Angeles for a very long time, and I haven't been there in the department for 6 years, so I can't tell you how it's going on, but you had different treatment of people. When you apply, they do a background check. And the people doing the background checks had biases. And so they were replicating themselves. So they were mostly older white people replicating themselves. If you had some people who had past due bills, they somehow got disqualified. So you have to get rid of the biases in hiring to start with. I think you have to pay people more because they start at a level that, won't attract the college graduates necessary or the people that are more interested in other things. And then you have to go through a process in your training of once you get them, to train them for what you want them to be, which is what we're not doing now. We're trying to do it more. LA, I think, maybe out in front of a lot of other places in trying to do it, but it's still not enough to take the person who comes in the door and says, well, okay, I want to be a policeman. I saw it on television. Once they enter that door, they're going to start being told what should you be like to be a police officer and what we want from you. And that's going to carry through their entire academy experience. Then they're going to go out in the field with a training officer, and you have to make sure those are all consistent to get you what you want. And then go to the sergeants and lieutenants to maintain it. But you have to start at the beginning by eliminating the biases from the people who are making the selection of who people get hired and giving them more incentives.
Got it. I mean, and also in that hiring question, there's been some questions that, how do we get people who can deal more with the mental health issues? I mean, I know Carol was talking about it earlier about it's a system that's just really needing, and I 1,000% agree. But how do we go about, getting more people into the system that have the right kind of qualifications and building that out?
As you said before, decide what you want your cops to do. You want cybercrime, you've got to get people who have software backgrounds in AI and that kind of stuff. You want people who solve problems, you got to go after people who solve problems in a lot of different disciplines. Right now, they do more recruiting of people coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq with no decompression time at all, which is crazy. They're not recruiting as many teachers. They're not going after women in a strategic way like they were supposed to. There's no desire to increase the number of women. There's no desire they're hanging on. There's a war between the gladiators and the guardians, the cops who want to move to the future and the cops who want to stick to the past. And you can see them, the conflicts, cops challenging the SWAT mafia, cops challenging the cliques and the deputies. We did those cases 25 and 30 years ago, and you keep having to do them over and over again because you haven't changed the structures, the incentives, the mission, and you haven't changed what you get promoted for. And women look at this. Women still face a horrible time inside of LAPD and the sheriffs. Our clients will run out almost to a woman. They were brilliant. They tested higher than everybody. They got through the academy, and because they were independent and wouldn't sign on to the thin blue line, I'll lie for you oaths that they force everybody to take, cover my back and lie for me, or we will run you out. They ran all of our clients out. And their message is loud and clear. Smart, independent women need not apply. And I still think that holds in LAPD to this day.
And I just to follow up quickly on that, I think that, you know, part of what Connie's referring to, we see these cliques and the deputies, we see them in different stations, we see the SWAT, we see all of that. All that seems to change is what is the unifying tattoo, but nothing about the underlying environment that allows this kind of group mentality to fester in the department.
So one of the questions is financial one. What size of investment is actually needed to build community capacity to adequately partner with CSP? And you know, how do you establish mutual accountability with the police, and how can communities be supported to actualize it?
That's a great question. One of the first things we had to do, for example, in the Jordan Downs CSP site was raise money to empower the Latino representatives to be on a par with the African-American representatives. That took $50,000. But after 2 years, we had partners who were of equal standing because we were not going to operate a segregated CSP. It depends on the site, Deb, but outside investment can range from a $100,000 grant to help enhance the programming for Summer Night Lights during the summer programs. Summer Night Lights is part of the Gang Reduction and Youth Development entity that Laura Chick and Cindy Misakowski and a whole bunch of us outsiders did together to force a more effective exit ramps out of gangs, block the entrance ramps, give alternative programming to kids in the high gang programs, make the hallways in schools safe from gang predation. All of that wraparound safety in those communities came from the grid. CSP is the kind of policing that goes with holistic safety. So when you look at the investment on the community side, that's the next iteration. Once we stabilize CSP, there are billions inside the county that are completely wasted and have to be redeployed to support these kinds of public safety strategies. I'll give you just one example. We identified $350 million in programs in the county that have the word gang in them. They couldn't do any audits. They couldn't tell us what performance measures they had. I said, just get me the list of programs that has the word gang in them. $350 million. They have no idea what that produces. Take that $350 million and invest it in these sites and get a county-wide counterpart to CSP. The amount of money that is wasted, I don't mean wasted in terms of slash and burn. I mean salary lines for people who sit in front of computer screens and attend meetings, but don't solve real problems in the real world. You have to redeploy your county workers. Now, the protesters are saying have mental health teams and so forth. Well, you got to remember when we stood up, when we put the 211 and 311 dispatch systems into effect, I don't really remember that. Chief Beck actually said, great, do the public health, get the mental health teams out there. They got folks designated, but the county workers that were designated, their unions stepped in and said, it's too dangerous for our workers to go out at night to Skid Row. We need armed officers. So what they missed, the advocates are still right. The first responders, however, have to be more like gang intervention. You have to hire homeless folks who have credibility in the encampments, who have credibility on the streets. They know who's off the meds. They know who's afraid of authority. They know who they can talk into going to the emergency room. They know how to interface between the officers and other homeless members of homeless communities and make sure that their belongings don't get taken and so forth, and they get treatment rather than punishment. You have to pay, organize, and professionalize a core of homeless advocates, just like we pay, professionalize, insure, and mobilize former gang members who are gang interventionists. You have to have interventionists with the county workers to make that first responder model work. That's where the money needs to go in the investment. We don't need to raise taxes. We just need to invest properly and use the salary lines and the money that's already in the system in a strategic way.
So can I just push back a little bit on that? I deal with a lot of instances where homeless people are moved into shelters, and the shelters are staffed by formerly homeless people. If you're going to put somebody in that position, you need to really make sure that they are trained and counseled about how really to work with people. Because what I see happen over and over again is that while it's great for some people and you have to filter out who can really do that job, for a lot of other people, it is a problem to put somebody in that position. So we have places, and I work in Orange County as well, where a particular shelter may be staffed only by formerly homeless people. Complaints of sexual harassment, complaints that people got kicked out because they, quote, disrespected that staff person. It is, and even some of my clients who don't go into doing that work, what I see is once they sort of get religion, they don't have the room to allow that other people may take a little longer than they did to get to that point. And I'm talking to people that I've represented for years, and all of a sudden they get housed, they get out of it, and it's like, boom, well, how come that other person is asking me for money now? They're really useless, all of that. So I think it is a really delicate balance, and I don't think that the proper assessment occurs based on dozens and dozens of shelters that we have clients in.
You know, Carol, actually, we have a question from Eileen Adams, who you all know, but you know, she wanted to know that legislatively, are there some laws that we just need to get rid of? You know, you mentioned the open container law. There are other kinds of things that are sort of used, let's just call them easy pickups. Are there ones that are on top of your mind that just shouldn't even be there, you know, and we should make an effort to try to get rid of some of those?
Well, some of the ones that I've dealt with in LA when they started the Safer Cities, and we still have this problem, is all of those sort of pedestrian laws. You know, I don't know that we need to get rid of all of them, although I don't see how much use they are. But what I think we need to do is make sure that our police are informed that those laws have already been declared unconstitutional in the way they are using it. Let me give you an example. Pedestrian in a roadway, on a street. The law expressly says that does not apply in a business or residential zone in a city. Despite that, that was one of the most favored laws to arrest people and put them in jail when Bratton started the Safer Cities initiative. It didn't apply. And we had to go to court and say, here's the Court of Appeal decision from 40 years ago saying that LA had enough time to understand that that law did not apply to it. Here we were 40 years later dealing with the same law that the Court of Appeal had condemned them for enforcing 40 years earlier. So I think that some of it is just, you know, maybe we should take that law off the books. If they can't read it right and they can't remember that they've been dinged by the courts repeatedly, maybe we should just take that off the books and just have a sort of a general safety about not walking in a way that interferes with traffic and define what that means. We have others about, the other most favored one was, let me give you an example of a law we changed, okay? So one of the most used one was crossing after the red light started flashing in a crosswalk. And that was probably one of the most cited ones in the Safer Cities initiative. And then what happened? It's a horrible thing that happened. It was a tragedy, public tragedy. A group of lawyers got cited for crossing on the flashing red light going to the federal courthouse. And oh my God, we got rid of the law. And now you only have to give enough time to cross. Rethinking something like that, we had thousands and thousands of people on Skid Row who were cited and taken into custody on that law. It took a bunch of lawyers getting cited crossing to the federal courthouse to change the law statewide. I think it was Bob Hertzberg who got it changed because, you know, this is a really good example of a law that's inappropriate. It didn't matter when it was poor people. So there are things like that. I don't know if that answers Eileen's question, but I think we ought to look at some of these and figure out what are people being cited for? What was the origin of that law? Do we need that law anymore? Or do we need to rewrite it?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because it sort of retracts sort of what I was talking about earlier with the 3 strikes. We needed to come back at it and just do it a little bit better and for a current time. So, well, we're at the end of the question and answer. I want to turn it back over to Cynthia, but I want to thank all of you, and I want to apologize to all of those who we couldn't answer all of your questions, just couldn't get to it. But really, thank you for being engaged and teeing those up for us, Cynthia.
Hi, I just want to thank you all. This was really illuminating and inspiring and necessary, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you and with the attendees and everything that we can do through our Civicas network. We post regularly articles and conversations about this on our website. We send out a newsletter, and we have a page dedicated to social justice resources. So I hope that in the continuing education that you've all discussed, people can look to that. And we look forward to being more educated ourselves, and as people with influence and resources, working to solve some of these issues after the listening and the education that is appropriate is done. And we are here to help in any way we can. And thank you just very much. We really appreciate your time and dedication to all of this. Thank you.